What if everything you were taught about Africa was the edited version? Not the lies, not the full truth either, just the version. The one where certain things get mentioned and certain things don't. The one that explains the poverty, but never explains what created the poverty. The one that talks about the problems, but never talks about who built the system that produces those problems. Here's the version they didn't teach you. Africa sits on top of roughly 30% of the world's mineral reserves. The Democratic Republic of Congo alone contains an estimated $24 trillion in untapped mineral wealth. That's more than the GDP of the United States. The continent holds 60% of the world's uncultivated arable land. It has more fresh water, more biodiversity, more solar potential than almost anywhere on Earth. And yet, the image most people carry of Africa is not $24 trillion. It's not 60% of the world's farmland. It's the image that was chosen for them, constructed for them. The same image, recycled for decades. I want you to hold that contradiction in your head. The richest continent, the poorest outcomes. Because that gap, that impossibly wide gap between what's in the ground and what's in people's pockets is not an accident of history. It was engineered. Before we get to the men in suits drawing lines on maps, I need you to understand what Africa looked like before they arrived. Because the colonial project needed a story that said Africa was empty, uncivilized, waiting to be saved. And that story was so thoroughly told for so long by so many people in power that even today it echoes in how the continent gets covered, discussed, and understood. So let me tell you a different story. In the 14th century, the ruler of the Mali Empire, Mansa Musa, made a pilgrimage to Mecca. He brought with him an entourage of 60,000 people and so much gold that when he passed through Cairo, he crashed the regional gold market for a decade. Economists who've tried to calculate his wealth in modern terms put the figure somewhere around $400 billion. $400 billion. One man, 1324. The University of Sankore in Timbuktu hosted 25,000 students and maintained the library of up to 700,000 manuscripts on subjects ranging from astronomy to medicine to political theory. 700,000 manuscripts in Mali in the 14th and 15th centuries. Great Zimbabwe, a city of dry stone towers and walls built without a single drop of mortar, housed tens of thousands of people and controlled trade routes connecting the African interior to Arab and Indian Ocean merchants. When European explorers encountered the ruins in the 19th century, they refused to believe Africans had built them. They invented theories. Phoenicians, they said, Arabs, ancient Israelites, anyone but the people who actually lived there. The Kingdom of Congo had diplomatic relations with Portugal, not as a subject state, but as an equal. King Alfonso I wrote letters to the King of Portugal and to the Pope, meticulously documenting the illegal slave trading being conducted in his territory. He named ships, he named captains, he cited treaty violations. They ignored him. The Agoji of Dahomey, an all-female military regiment, trained from childhood, feared across West Africa, predated any discussion of women in combat roles in Western militaries by roughly 3 centuries. Hollywood made a film about them in 2022. They existed since the 1600s. I'm not telling you pre-colonial Africa was perfect. It wasn't. No civilization is. But it was complex, literate, economically sophisticated, and fully capable of governing itself. And that is the thing the colonial project needed you to forget. November 15, 1884, Berlin, Germany. 14 nations sit around a table. Britain, France, Belgium, Portugal, Germany, Italy, Spain, Austria-Hungary, 13 more. Not one African is in the room. Not one. They are there to divide Africa, formally, legally, diplomatically. They called it the Berlin Conference. They called the process it launched the Scramble for Africa. And in less than 10 years, 90% of the African continent was under European colonial control. They drew lines on a map, not lines that followed rivers or mountain ranges or the boundaries of human communities. Lines made with rulers on paper by men who had never visited most of the places they were dividing. The Maasai split between British Kenya and German Tanganyika. The Somali divided into 5 separate colonial territories. The Iwe people of West Africa cut directly in half between British Gold Coast and German Togoland. Families separated, trade routes interrupted, communities that had existed for centuries redefined as foreigners to each other overnight. Now let me tell you what happened in the Congo. King Leopold II of Belgium was handed the Congo, a territory the size of Western Europe, as his private property, not as a Belgian colony, as his estate. His rubber extraction operation was enforced by a private army with a documented policy. To prove bullets hadn't been wasted on animals, soldiers who killed Congolese villagers were required to bring back severed hands as evidence. Baskets of them. Children's hands. An estimated 2 to 10 million Congolese died under Leopold's personal rule. The uncertainty in that number, 2 to 10 million, is itself the indictment. Nobody who profited from their deaths was counting. When public pressure finally forced Leopold to hand the Congo to the Belgian state in 1908, Belgium continued extracting Congolese labor and resources for another 50 years. And this, I need you to hear this clearly, was not a Belgian exception. It was a European standard. Britain, France, Germany, Portugal, Italy, each operating their own version of the same logic in their own territories. The word for this isn't complicated. It's theft. Industrialized, legitimized, and documented in careful bureaucratic detail. Then came the 1950s and 60s, independence. The flags went up, the anthems were written, leaders gave speeches that made people weep in the streets. Kwame Nkrumah stood before 100,000 people in Accra in 1957 and said, "Ghana, your beloved country, is free forever."
Ghana, your beloved country, is free forever.
He was removed in a CIA-assisted coup 9 years later. His crime? He wrote a book called Neo-Colonialism. He argued that political independence without economic independence was meaningless, that you could have a flag and a president and still be controlled from abroad through your currency, your debt, and your trade arrangements. He was right, and the people he was describing proved him right by removing him. Patrice Lumumba, elected Prime Minister of the Congo in 1960, in office for 67 days before he was deposed, tortured, shot, and dissolved in acid. The CIA's involvement was formally acknowledged by the U.S. Senate Intelligence Committee in 1975. His crime? He wanted Congo's mineral wealth to benefit Congolese people. Thomas Sankara, president of Burkina Faso from 1983 to 1987. In 4 years, he raised childhood vaccination rates from 30 to 80%, planted 10 million trees, redistributed land to farmers, and refused to pay what he called odious colonial debt. He was shot in October 1987. His successor reversed every single one of his policies within months. This is not conspiracy theory. This is declassified, documented, on-the-record history. And then there's France. 14 West African nations, upon independence, were required to sign agreements keeping their currencies tied to the French franc, the CFA franc, managed from Paris, requiring that a significant portion of their foreign exchange reserves be deposited in the French treasury. Prioritizing French companies and government contracts, allowing French military presence without restriction, and paying France, this is real, this is documented, paying France ongoing fees for the colonial infrastructure that France had built in their countries, roads and railways constructed using African labor on African land, financed by the extraction of African resources, billed to African nations as a debt. The one leader who said no, Sékou Touré of Guinea. France withdrew every official within days, took the files, took the furniture, disabled the infrastructure on the way out. Guinea suffered for decades. The message was clear. This is what choosing full independence costs. If you think this is ancient history, you're not paying attention. Right now, in 2026, a new scramble for Africa is underway. Different actors, different methods, same fundamental logic. China has become Africa's largest trading partner, with bilateral trade approaching $300 billion annually. The Belt and Road Initiative has financed roads, railways, ports, and stadiums across the continent. The infrastructure is real. The terms matter.
The standard gauge railway in Kenya was built by Chinese loans, operated by a Chinese company with revenues not sufficient to cover the debt repayments. The port of Mombasa was listed as collateral in the loan agreement, Kenya's main port as collateral. Russia, through the Wagner Group, now rebranded as Africa Corps under direct Russian military defense control, has deployed across the Sahel. The model is simple: security in exchange for mining concessions. Russian forces protect governments. Those governments grant Russian companies access to gold, diamonds, and uranium. No transparency, no taxation, no strings attached. In Burkina Faso, fatalities linked to militant violence have nearly tripled since the military coup in 2022, the coup that was supposed to improve security. Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, all under military juntas that promise stability and have presided over the worst security deterioration in their modern histories. And yet, in January 2025, these three nations formally withdrew from ECOWAS, the West African regional bloc that has held together for 50 years. They formed the Alliance of Sahel states. They are now pursuing their own currency to replace the CFA franc.
They've banned French media, they've expelled French troops, they've rewritten mining contracts. Whether this represents genuine sovereignty or simply a trade of one external dependency for another, from Paris to Moscow, is the defining geopolitical question of the Sahel right now. Meanwhile, in Sudan, the largest displacement crisis on Earth, over 12 million people displaced, a civil war between two military factions, both accused of war crimes, that has been running since April 2023, destroying Khartoum, massacring civilians in Darfur, and receiving a fraction of the international media coverage given to conflicts in other parts of the world with lower casualty numbers. Ask yourself why. Who decides which wars get covered, and who benefits from this one staying invisible? Here's what all of this adds up to. Africa was not born poor. Africa was not born unstable. Africa was not born with some inherent deficit of governance or civilization or capacity. Africa was systematically stripped of its labor, of its minerals, of its land, of its political leaders when those leaders prioritized African interests, of its monetary sovereignty through currency arrangements designed in Paris, of its ability to industrialize through trade terms that kept it locked into exporting raw materials and importing manufactured goods. Walter Rodney, the Guyanese economist who spent his career documenting this with meticulous evidence, called it the deliberate underdevelopment of Africa. He published his argument in 1972. He was assassinated by car bomb in 1980. He was 38 years old. His book is still not on most Western school curricula. Now, I want to be precise about something. I am not saying Africa has no internal challenges. It does. African political actors have made destructive choices. African institutions have failed their people. African leaders have stolen from their countries. All of that is true, and none of it should be minimized. But here's what I am saying. Virtually every African kleptocrat who stayed in power for decades had external sponsors, external banks, external weapon suppliers, external diplomatic cover. Mobutu Sese Seko looted the Congo for 32 years while receiving billions in Western aid because he was anti-communist and gave Western companies access to Congolese minerals. The corruption did not happen in isolation. It was made possible, sustained, and in many cases deliberately cultivated by external actors who found corrupt governments more convenient to deal with than accountable ones. That is the conversation that doesn't happen. That is the half of the story that gets dropped every time someone says, well, Africa needs to sort itself out. Sort itself out with what resources, within what systems, under what external pressures, after what history. But here's the thing I refuse to end on. Africa has a median age of 19. 19! It is the youngest continent on Earth. Its population will double by 2050, making it home to 1 in 4 human beings on the planet. The African Continental Free Trade Area, the largest free trade zone in the world by participating nations, is slowly, imperfectly, but genuinely restructuring how African economies relate to each other rather than only to external partners. In Senegal, a president was elected in 2024 on an explicit platform of monetary sovereignty, renegotiating oil and gas contracts, pushing CFA franc exit, demanding that Senegal's resources benefit Senegalese people.
In Kenya, Nigeria, Ghana, Rwanda, tech ecosystems are growing. Young entrepreneurs are building companies. A generation that grew up with smartphones and global connectivity is asking different questions and making different demands than any generation before them. The End SARS protests in Nigeria, the Gen Z uprising in Kenya in 2025, the youth who drove Sudan's 2019 revolution before the military stole it back. A continent of young people who know exactly what the history is, who have read the books, who are connected to each other and to the world, and who are not willing to accept the terms they inherited. That generation is the most important geopolitical force on Earth right now. Not Wagner, not China, not France. The 19-year-old in Lagos, in Nairobi, in Dakar, in Khartoum, who knows the history, who feels the weight of it, and who is building something in spite of it. Africa doesn't need saving. It needs the world to stop taking and start reckoning. You've just spent several minutes with 10 centuries of history. What you do with it, that's yours.